next speaker is Andreas Scheidleder from Austria. Andreas is a distinguished groundwater expert working at the Environmental Agency of Austria. He's chairperson of the Groundwater Task Force of the International Commission for the Protection of Danube River in Vienna, Austria. He will present his speech about the groundwater in the Danube River Basin, importance for drinking water supply and pollution by hazardous substances. Please, Dr.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen. So it's a great honor for me to have given the chance to give a focus on the groundwater issue in the Danube River Basin. I prepared this presentation together with Igor Lischka from the ICPDR Secretariat. He's also sitting here. And the focus in my presentation will be, on the one hand, the importance of groundwater demonstrated by its use for drinking water, and on the other hand, to give some hints about pollution of groundwater due to hazardous substances. But before I go into the drinking water aspects and the pollution, I would like to give a brief overview about the ICPDR. So first, we are just showing the people who are not so familiar with the European area. There are people from 22 countries, we learned before. So the Danube is the second largest river in Europe, but the largest and the most international river basin district. It has a size of more than 800,000 square kilometers. 19 countries are sharing the Danube River Basin, and about 80 million people are living in this area. So the ICPDR is the International Commission for the Protection of the Danube River. It was established 18 years ago to implement the Danube River Protection Convention. So it works to ensure the sustainable and equitable use of water and freshwater resources in the Danube River Basin. So in the year 2000, it was also initiated that ICPDR is the platform for the implementation of all the transboundary aspects under the Water Framework Directive. And recently, in 2007, it was also decided that ICPDR is responsible for the Floods Directive, for the aspects of the transboundary aspects on the level of the river basin of the Danube. If you'd like to get more information, then I warmly recommend you to click on the link to get to the website of the ICPDR. So the ICPDR, in principle, the overarching basics is the Danube River Protection Convention, and the ICPDR is formed of 15 contracting parties, the Secretariat, which is located in Vienna and represented by Ivan Zawatsky, and also Igor Lischka is here today. There are 8 expert groups, and then there are 4 task groups. And this organigram is also accompanied by 23 observer organizations. So the ICPDR has to deal with 15 contracting parties, which means 14 legislations, 9 EU member states and 5 non-EU member countries. So this is really a challenging issue, because when you want to implement the Water Framework Directive in the whole basin, then you always have to consider that 5 countries are not members of the European Union. And the European Commission, the European Union, is also a contracting party to the ICPDR. So ICPDR just focuses on the basin level, on the level A, and also on the sub-basin level, like the Tisza River Basin or the Brut River Basin. But it does not focus on the national level. So this is just the duty of the countries, and the ICPDR does not interfere to this national level. As I mentioned before, there are several task groups, and one of these task groups is a groundwater task group. And this task group was established to deal with all these groundwater aspects in the Danube Basin level, and there is no duplication of work and assessments to the national level. So the work of the ICPDR just relies on what is available on the national level. On the one hand, it enables and supports the international coordination, which is requested by the Water Framework Directive in several articles, and it contributes to this transboundary coordination that is requested in the implementation of the directive. But apart from that, the groundwater working group is also, or task group is also obliged to provide the ICPDR with all this groundwater-related information that the ICPDR needs to prepare Danube-level reports. So as I mentioned before, the focus is on the basin-wide level. Therefore, the groundwater task group also only focuses on groundwater bodies of basin-wide concern, which means that there was a procedure to select and to identify these important transboundary groundwater bodies, and we're now dealing with 11 groundwater bodies. And on the map you see these 11 groundwater bodies, which are all transboundary. So now to the importance of groundwater in the basin. Ivan mentioned already at the beginning in the opening statement that that groundwater in the Danube Basin is very crucial for the production of drinking water. So 72% of the drinking water comes from the groundwater. And this groundwater serves nearly 60 million people in the basin. So this is a quite huge amount of people. When we look in detail for each of these countries, we see that there is a variation, there is a range. So in some countries use 100% of the groundwater for drinking water, and other countries, like Bulgaria at the bottom, they are only using 30% for drinking water from groundwater. When we look at geographical distribution, then we easily see that the upstream countries use groundwater more heavily than the downstream countries. So only in Bulgaria, the share of groundwater for drinking water production is less than 50%. But all the upstream countries, it's more than 50%. But when we speak about drinking water production from groundwater, we should not also forget that there is a link between surface water and groundwater. There are many abstractions along the Danube, along the rivers in the basin, which make use of both the surface water and the groundwater, which is used for drinking water. So it depends on geology and the distance of the wells, what is the share of groundwater that is abstracted and what is the share of the river water that is moving through the soil to the well. And we made an inventory of collecting information for the most important bank filtration abstraction sites along the Danube, only along the Danube. So we collected information for about 40 locations in 8 countries, and we could easily demonstrate that by these 40 locations, 4 million people are actually served for drinking water, and additional 5 million people could be served due to the permitted annual abstractions. So this is, you can see that there is still a strategic reserve that where the countries rely on in case of shortage of water in other areas. But this connection between the surface water and the groundwater also shows that it's inevitable to raise the awareness that there is a connection and that the pollution of surface water also has consequences in the groundwater and might endanger the safe provision of drinking water to the people. So this is just in detail all the 40 or more than 40 abstraction size, so it varies considerable from abstraction to abstraction The red column you see is the actual abstraction, and the blue one is the possible abstraction. In this activity, about 50 compounds were analyzed parallel in the surface water and also in 10 groundwater sites where drinking water is abstracted, and it showed very interesting results. And this activity was performed by TZW Karlsruhe, by Florian Stork, Doreen Richter, and Heinz-Jürgen Brauch. And you heard him just recently. So several emerging substances were detected. The focus was on emerging substances. Amidotrizoic acid, for example, iopamidol, acesulfam, bentotiazol, carbamazepine. And the concentrations in groundwater were mostly below 0.1 microgram per liter, except the sweetener acesulfam, which was detected up to 0.45 microgram. And in groundwater and in parallel, it was detected in the Danube with 1.1 microgram per liter. So in principle, acesulfam is not a harmful substance, it's a sweetener, but imagine you have a substance that has similar properties like this substance, and it is entering the Danube, then there is a reasonable concern that it might also enter the groundwater by the same way and the same pathway as acesulfam does. So all the inputs in the Danube of substances like that has to be prevented. But we also had a look at to find out what are the hazardous substances in the Danube that are polluting groundwater. And it's not so easy to get that information. So the Water Framework Directive is very helpful in that, because all the member states have to report about poor status of groundwater bodies. They also have to report about the substances that are causing this poor status. And whenever a groundwater body is in poor status, then it is of a major concern. Measures have to be implemented. So it's not a case study pollution on a small site. If a groundwater body is identified poor status, then there is a considerable pollution evident. So therefore, we compiled all the information of the hazardous substances causing poor status, but also we looked at the substances where threshold values have been established. And the Water Framework Directive covers, in this case, only 80% of the river basin. Therefore, we were very thankful about the in-kind contributions of the representatives in the groundwater task group to complete the picture for the whole Danube. So in fact, in the river basin district of the Danube, there are 722 groundwater bodies. 3/4 of them are in good status, good chemical status. For 26 groundwater bodies, there is an unknown status, and 153 are in poor status. And from this 153, 54 groundwater bodies in 6 member states are in poor status due to hazardous substances. So this means 7% of these 722 groundwater bodies are in poor status due to hazardous substances. And you find here the list of these 6 member states and the number of groundwater bodies in poor status compared to the total number of groundwater bodies in this country and in this part of the Danube River Basin. When we look in detail, there are 32 hazardous substances which cause this poor status. So it's in fact 6 naturally occurring, which are metals, and then there are also 26 synthetic substances. Some of them are pesticides, but mainly it's chlorinated hydrocarbons. In this overview, you see the number of groundwater bodies that are affected by each of these substances. So when looking at the threshold values, the background of threshold values is that the Water Framework Directive and the Groundwater Directive require the establishment of threshold values, which are national groundwater standards, due to the following reason. So if there is a risk that the substance can cause a poor status of a groundwater body, then a member state has to establish such threshold values. And they have to consider the needs of the aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems that are depending on this groundwater, and these threshold values have also to consider the uses of the groundwater. So in cases where groundwater is used for drinking water purpose, then the drinking water standards are relevant to be considered. But a threshold value established itself does not give direct evidence that there is a pollution. So many countries establish threshold values because they want to use it for the status assessment, and therefore a threshold value is not a direct indication of poor status or a problem, but whenever a threshold value is established, then there is relevance and a potential significant pressure and a reason why this threshold value has been established. So nobody will establish threshold value without any reason because it's extrovert. So to summarize that, 10 countries established threshold values for 72 more or less hazardous substances, 18 metals, 14 pesticides, and 40 hydrocarbons and synthetic substances. But what also has to be considered is that there are partly very huge variations between these threshold values, and this is due to the nature of the establishment of these values, which consider also the natural background levels due to geology and also different uses, the different needs of ecosystems and so on. So these are very individual quality standards on the level of groundwater bodies or river basins. Now to conclude, it's just groundwater is by far the major source of drinking water in the Danube River Basin, so we have to take care about that. That's why we need to raise awareness that the pollution also of surface water might affect the groundwater and also might affect the usability for drinking water purpose, which are demonstrated through this bank filtration usage of water, abstraction of water. So 70% of all the groundwater bodies in the Danube River Basin are affected by the pollution of hazardous substances, hydrocarbons mainly, pesticides and metals. And I would be because this assessment was made based on the first River Basin Management Plan, I would be very interested looking forward in a comparison, seeing about the development between the first River Basin Management Plan and the second one, which is now currently reported to the European Union. So thank you very much.